We can't have her cooking again, Marcus. Last year was a disaster and I'm not dealing with that embarrassment in front of my parents. Those were the words that changed everything, spoken by my daughter-in-law Rebecca as she stood in my kitchen, thinking I was upstairs taking my afternoon rest. But I was right there, frozen behind the pantry door, listening to her convince my son that his mother was too old, too incompetent, too much of a liability to host Christmas dinner in the home. I'd been preparing holiday meals and for 37 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I am Esther Cohen, 71 years old, and until that December afternoon, I believed I was living the golden years every mother dreams of. My son Marcus had moved back into the family home 2 years earlier with his wife Rebecca and their 8-year-old daughter Sophia after what they called a temporary financial setback. Temporary had stretched into permanent, but I didn't mind. The house felt alive again with the sound of little feet running up and down the hardwood stairs, the smell of Rebecca's vanilla candles mixing with my own cooking, and the comfortable chaos of a multi-generational household. Or so I thought. My days had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. Every morning at 6, I would wake to the sound of the old radiator clanking to life, a sound that had been my alarm clock since Harold and I bought this Victorian home in 1987. The house sat on Maple Street in what used to be the nicest part of town, with its wraparound porch and original crown molding that Harold spent 3 summers restoring by hand. After he passed 5 years ago, the house had felt too big, too quiet, too full of memories that echoed in empty rooms. Having Marcus, Rebecca, and Sophia fill those spaces again had felt like a gift, like the universe giving me a second chance. At the kind of bustling family life I'd always cherished. I took pride in maintaining the household. Every Tuesday, I would grocery shop with a list organized by aisle, always checking the weekly circulars for the best deals. Rebecca worked long hours at the marketing firm downtown, and Marcus had been between jobs for the better part of a year, so it made sense that I would handle the domestic responsibilities. I cooked dinner most nights, rotating between family favorites and new recipes I found in the cooking magazines I'd subscribed to for decades. Sophia loved my Thursday night tradition of homemade pizza where she could choose her own toppings, and even Rebecca would sometimes compliment my Sunday pot roast. The laundry was always done and folded by Wednesday evening. I had a system for everything, the kind of organizational habits that come from raising 3 children mostly on my own while Harold worked double shifts at the steel plant. Marcus was my youngest, the baby who came along 8 years after his sisters, and perhaps because of that gap, he'd always been my most affectionate child. Even as an adult, he would still hug me goodnight and tell me he loved me, still asked for my advice about everything from job interviews to anniversary gifts. For Rebecca and I had developed what I thought was a comfortable relationship. She wasn't particularly warm, but I attributed that to generational differences and the stress of their financial situation. She called me Mrs. Cohen rather than Mom, despite my gentle suggestions otherwise, and she had her own way of doing things that sometimes clashed with mine. But we managed. She would ask me to watch Sophia when she had evening work events, and I was always happy to help. On weekends, she would sometimes join me in the garden, though she preferred giving directions to actually getting her hands dirty. Sophia was the light of my world, a bright, curious little girl with Rebecca's auburn hair and Marcus's gentle brown eyes. She would sit with me at the kitchen table while I paid bills, asking questions about everything from why stamps cost money to how long it takes for vegetables to grow. I taught her to knead bread, to identify herbs in the garden, and to play the card games my own grandmother had taught me. On rainy afternoons, we would work on jigsaw puzzles, her small fingers surprisingly patient with the tiny pieces. The house itself had become a source of deep satisfaction for me. After Harold's death, I had considered selling and moving into one of those senior living communities with their scheduled activities and communal dining rooms. But the thought of leaving the place where I'd raised my children, where I'd shared 43 years of marriage, where every room held memories layered like paint on the walls, felt impossible. Instead, I'd thrown myself into maintaining it, updating what needed updating while preserving the character that made it home. The kitchen was my domain, with its farmhouse sink and the gas stove I'd convinced Harold to install during our kitchen renovation in 1995. The pantry was organized with military precision, canned goods arranged by type and expiration date, spices alphabetized in the rack Harold had built for my 50th birthday. The refrigerator was covered with Sophia's artwork, school schedules, and the grocery lists I wrote in the same careful handwriting I'd developed as a young teacher before I became a full-time mother. I had my routines, my small pleasures, my sense of purpose. Tuesday mornings were for the farmer's market where I knew all the vendors by name. Wednesday afternoons were for volunteer work at the local food bank, something I'd started after Harold died to fill the empty hours. Friday. Evenings were for phone calls with my daughters, both of whom lived out of state with families of their own. I attended services at Temple Beth Shalom every Saturday morning, sitting in the same pew I'd occupied for 35 years, catching up with friends over coffee and rugula afterward. Money wasn't abundant, but it was sufficient. Harold's pension and my own small retirement account from my teaching years, combined with Social Security, covered my expenses comfortably. I owned the house outright, having paid off the mortgage 3 years before Harold died. I was careful with spending but not stingy, and I enjoyed being able to contribute to the household expenses and occasionally treat Sophia to small gifts or outings. The arrangement with Marcus and his family felt natural, even beneficial. They helped with some of the heavier household tasks, provided companionship, and brought energy back into rooms that had grown too quiet. In return, I provided stability, childcare, and the kind of institutional knowledge that comes from decades of managing a household. Rebecca mentioned occasionally that they were looking for their own place, but there was never any urgency to it, and frankly, I was in no hurry to see them go. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year. Harold used to joke that I started planning next year's celebration before New Year's Day arrived. I collected decorations throughout the year, haunting post-holiday sales and antique stores for unique ornaments and festive serving pieces. The house would transform every December into something magical, with garland wrapped around the stair banister, lights twinkling in every window, and the scent of cinnamon and pine filling every room. Last year's Christmas had been particularly special because it was the first time since Harold's death that the house felt fully alive during the holidays. Sophia's excitement was infectious as she helped me decorate the tree, carefully hanging each ornament while I told her the story behind it. Rebecca had invited her parents and sister to join us for Christmas dinner, and I had spent weeks planning the menu, preparing traditional dishes alongside some new recipes I'd found in a holiday cooking magazine. The dinner itself had been ambitious, perhaps overly so. I'd made everything from scratch: herb-crusted prime rib, 3 different side dishes, fresh bread, and 2 desserts. I'd wanted to impress Rebecca's family, to show them that Marcus had married into a family that valued tradition and hospitality. The timing had been tricky, trying to coordinate multiple dishes in my single oven, and I'd made some minor mistakes. The rolls had gotten a bit overdone, and the green bean casserole had been slightly underseasoned. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that couldn't be remedied with a little butter and salt, but I'd been flustered by the complexity of feeding 9 people and making sure everything was perfect. Rebecca's mother had made a few comments about the rolls being well done, and had asked if I needed help in the kitchen with a tone that suggested I clearly did. Her father had been polite but distant, the kind of man who expects his dinner to appear on time and properly prepared without any visible effort or stress from the cook. Rebecca herself had seemed embarrassed by my minor kitchen fumbles, jumping up to help in a way that felt more like damage control than assistance. But I thought we'd all moved past that. The meal had been eaten, the compliments had been given, the evening had ended with Sophia falling asleep in my lap while we watched A Christmas Story. I'd gone to bed that night tired but happy, feeling like I'd successfully carried on the tradition of Cohen family Christmas dinners even without Harold there to carve the roast and tell his terrible holiday jokes. Throughout the following year, Christmas had rarely come up in conversation. Rebecca would occasionally mention holiday plans when talking to her mother on the phone, but it was always vague references to seeing how things work out or playing it by ear. I'd assumed we would follow the same pattern as last year, perhaps with a few adjustments based on what I'd learned about timing and preparation. I'd already started collecting recipes and making notes about what had worked and what could be improved. I'd been particularly excited about this year's celebration because Sophia had become such an enthusiastic helper in the kitchen. Over the summer, she'd spent countless hours with me learning to make cookies, helping with simple dinner preparations, and even expressing interest in learning some of the traditional Jewish dishes that Harold's mother had taught me when I was a young bride. I'd envisioned Christmas dinner as an opportunity to pass down some of that culinary knowledge, to create new traditions that blended our family history with contemporary celebrations. The November afternoon when everything changed had started. Like any other. I'd been to the grocery store, stocking up for Thanksgiving preparations, and had stopped by the library to return some books and pick up a few holiday cooking magazines that had just arrived. The house was quiet when I returned, with Rebecca still at work and Sophia at school. Marcus was in the living room, working on his laptop and talking quietly on the phone, probably following up on one of the job leads that never seemed to materialize into actual employment. I'd put away the groceries and was organizing my holiday recipe collection when I heard Rebecca's car in the driveway. She came through the back door with her usual rushed energy, dropping her purse and keys on the kitchen counter and immediately launching into a phone conversation with someone about work deadlines and client presentations. I continued my recipe organizing, half listening to her professional drama while mentally planning the Thanksgiving menu. It was when Marcus joined her in the kitchen that the conversation shifted. I was in the pantry, standing on a step stool to reach the higher shelves where I stored seasonal items, when I heard Rebecca lower her voice and begin talking about Christmas plans. At first, I was pleased that she was thinking ahead, showing the kind of organizational mindset that I'd always respected in her approach to work and family management. But as I listened more carefully, still hidden behind the pantry door with my arms full of holiday serving dishes, I realized she wasn't planning our Christmas dinner. She was planning how to prevent me from hosting it. "Your mother means well," Rebecca was saying in the tone she used when she was trying to sound reasonable while delivering unreasonable demands. But last year was honestly painful to watch. The timing was all wrong, the food was overcooked, and she was clearly overwhelmed by having my whole family there. I can't put her through that again, and I definitely can't put my parents through it again. I stopped moving, barely breathing, straining to hear Marcus's response. My son, my baby, the child I'd sacrificed so much for, the man I'd welcomed back into my home without question when his world fell apart. "I know it wasn't perfect," Marcus said, and I could hear the weakness in his voice, the same tone he'd used as a child when he was trying to avoid conflict. "But she worked really hard on that dinner. She was just trying to make a good impression on your family." "That's exactly the problem," Rebecca continued, and I could hear her moving around the kitchen, probably doing her usual straightening ritual that followed her workday. "She's trying too hard to prove something instead of just admitting that she's not up for this anymore. She's 71 years old, Marcus. It's time to be realistic about what she can and can't handle." The casual dismissal in her voice hit me like cold water. Not up for this anymore. As if age had suddenly rendered me incompetent, as if one imperfect meal had erased decades of successful entertaining, as if the woman who'd managed household budgets during economic recessions and raised 3 children through various crises was now too feeble to coordinate a holiday dinner. "What are you suggesting?" Marcus asked, and I held my breath waiting for his response, praying that he would defend me, that he would remind his wife of everything I'd done for their family, everything I continued to do every single day to make their lives easier and more comfortable. "We host it here," Rebecca said matter-of-factly. "I'll handle the cooking and planning. We can invite your sisters and your mother can help with small things, like setting the table or arranging flowers. She'll still be part of it, but we won't have to worry about the disaster of last year happening again." The condescension was breathtaking. Help with small things. Like I was a child being given busy work to keep me occupied while the adults handled the real responsibilities. Like my 37 years of hosting Christmas dinners, my decades of cooking experience, my deep knowledge of our family's traditions and preferences were now irrelevant because Rebecca had decided I was past my expiration date. "I don't know, Becca," Marcus said weakly. "This is her house. Christmas dinner has always been her thing. She looks forward to it all year." "Exactly," Rebecca replied, and I could hear the impatience creeping into her voice. "She looks forward to it, which means she puts all this pressure on herself to make it perfect, and then she gets overwhelmed and makes mistakes. I'm trying to save her from that stress. We'll still have Christmas dinner, just with better planning and execution." Better planning and execution. As if I were a failed project manager rather than a mother and grandmother who'd been successfully organizing family celebrations since before Rebecca was born. As if the minor issues from last year's dinner were evidence of systemic incompetence, rather than the natural challenges that come with cooking for a large group in a single kitchen. I wanted to burst out of the pantry, to confront them both, to defend myself and my capabilities. But something held me back, some instinct that told me to listen, to gather information, to understand the full scope of what was happening before I reacted. So I stayed hidden, clutching my holiday serving dishes like shields, while my son and his wife discussed my future as if I weren't there, as if my opinions and feelings were irrelevant to decisions about my own home and traditions. "What if she doesn't want to give up hosting?" Marcus asked, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of hope that he might stand up for me. "Then we'll have to be firm about it," Rebecca said, and the steel in her voice made it clear that she'd already decided how this would go. "We can't have her cooking again, Marcus. Last year was a disaster and I'm not dealing with that embarrassment in front of my parents. They're still talking about those burned rolls and the chaos in the kitchen. It reflects poorly on all of us." There it was. The real issue wasn't my competence or stress levels or age-related limitations. It was Rebecca's embarrassment, her concern about how her family perceived our household, her need to maintain a certain image of control and sophistication. I wasn't being protected from stress, I was being removed from a role that she felt I performed inadequately according to her standards. "How do we tell her?" Marcus asked, and I could hear resignation in his voice. He wasn't going to fight for me. He wasn't going to defend my right to host Christmas dinner in my own home. He was capitulating to his wife's demands just as he capitulated to everything else in their marriage. We sit her down next week and explain that we want to take over the hosting duties, Rebecca said, as if she were discussing a work project handoff rather than stripping away one of my most cherished traditions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We frame it as us wanting to contribute more to the household, to take some burden off her shoulders. We make it sound like we're doing her a favor. A favor. Taking away my Christmas dinner was a favor. Relegating me to flower arranging and table setting in my own home was kindness. Removing me from a role I'd performed successfully for decades was somehow beneficial to me rather than convenient for them. I stood in that pantry for several more minutes, listening to them plan the details of my demotion. Rebecca would handle the menu planning and shopping. Marcus would be responsible for setup and cleanup. They would invite both sides of the family but keep the guest list smaller to make things more manageable. They would present it to me as a thoughtful gesture, a way for them to show their appreciation for everything I'd done for the family over the years. The manipulation was sophisticated, I had to give them credit for that. They weren't simply going to order me to step aside, they were going to convince me that stepping aside was what I wanted, what was best for everyone, what any reasonable person in my situation would choose. They were going to make me complicit in my own marginalization. When they finally moved their conversation to the living room, I emerged from the pantry on shaking legs. I set the serving dishes on the counter with exaggerated care, afraid that my trembling hands might drop them. I looked around my kitchen, the heart of my home, the place where I'd nurtured my family for decades, and for the first time, it felt foreign. I felt foreign, like an intruder in my own space, like someone who'd overstayed their welcome without realizing it. That evening proceeded normally on the surface. I made dinner as usual, a simple weeknight meal of roasted chicken and vegetables. Sophia chattered about her school day, showing me a drawing she'd made of our family standing in front of the house, everyone smiling under a bright yellow sun. Rebecca talked about her work projects, mentioning upcoming deadlines and client meetings. Marcus was quieter than usual, but that wasn't unusual. He'd been withdrawn since losing his last job, spending most of his time on the computer pursuing opportunities that never seemed to materialize. I participated in the conversation, asked appropriate questions, offered encouragement where it seemed needed. But underneath the normalcy, I was processing what I'd overheard, trying to understand how I'd become someone whose contributions were seen as problems rather than gifts, whose enthusiasm was viewed as embarrassing rather than endearing, whose decades of experience were considered irrelevant rather than valuable. After dinner, I cleaned the kitchen while Rebecca helped Sophia with homework and Marcus returned to his laptop. I moved through my familiar routines mechanically, washing dishes, wiping counters, preparing coffee for the morning. But my mind was racing, replaying every interaction from the previous Christmas, analyzing every comment and gesture and expression for signs I'd missed, clues that should have warned me how Rebecca really felt about my hosting abilities. The burned rolls had been a minor issue, easily remedied and quickly forgotten by most of the guests. The under-seasoned green beans had been fixed with a simple addition of salt and pepper. The timing challenges were normal when cooking multiple dishes in a home kitchen for a large group. I'd hosted more complex dinners with greater success, but those had been for our own family and friends, people who appreciated the effort and forgave the imperfections, people who valued the love and tradition behind the meal more than its technical execution. Rebecca's family, I realized now, had been judging me by different standards. They'd been evaluating my performance rather than enjoying my hospitality. They'd been looking for flaws rather than appreciating the enormous amount of work and planning that went into creating a festive celebration for 9 people in a home kitchen. They'd been treating me like hired help rather than the matriarch of the family hosting them in her own home. And Rebecca, rather than defending me or explaining the context or simply accepting that home-cooked meals sometimes have minor imperfections, had apparently been mortified by my performance. She'd spent the past year nursing her embarrassment, planning how to prevent a repeat of what she saw as my failure, building a case for why I needed to be replaced as the family's Christmas dinner host. The betrayal cut deep, but what hurt even more was Marcus's willingness to go along with it. My son, who'd eaten thousands of meals prepared by my hands, who'd celebrated dozens of holidays in this house, who'd brought his own family to live under my roof when they needed support, was ready to strip away my traditions because his wife found them embarrassing. He wasn't fighting for me, wasn't defending my competence, wasn't even suggesting a compromise that might address Rebecca's concerns while preserving my role. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me. 3 generations breathing under one roof, but suddenly I felt completely alone. I thought about Harold, how he would have reacted to this situation. He'd never been one for confrontation, but he wouldn't have tolerated anyone disrespecting me in my own home. He'd have found a way to address the issue firmly but diplomatically, to protect my dignity while maintaining family harmony. But Harold was gone, and I was on my own to navigate this betrayal. The question was, what kind of woman was I going to be in response? Was I going to accept their characterization of me as an aging woman whose best days were behind her? Was I going to gracefully step aside and allow myself to be managed like a family burden? Was I going to pretend that their favor was actually kindness rather than the calculated removal of my authority in my own home? As I lay there in the darkness, something began to harden inside me. Not anger, exactly, but something colder and more determined. If Rebecca wanted to play games with my dignity, if Marcus was willing to sacrifice my feelings for his wife's comfort, if they thought I was too old and incompetent to notice what they were doing, then perhaps it was time to show them exactly how competent I could be when properly motivated. They thought they knew me, thought they understood the limits of my capabilities and my willingness to fight back. They'd miscalculated badly. I was Esther Cohen, and I'd been underestimated before. The people who'd made that mistake had always regretted it eventually. Rebecca and Marcus were about to learn that lesson themselves, though they wouldn't realize it until it was far too late to undo the damage they'd caused. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I made my coffee, read the newspaper, and began planning my response to their planned intervention. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with, how far their disrespect extended, and what resources I had at my disposal for addressing it. Knowledge, as Harold used to say, was the foundation of all effective action. It was time to get educated about my situation and my options. The education process would prove far more revealing than I'd expected. The conversation I'd witnessed happened on a Tuesday afternoon. By Friday evening, I'd begun to notice things I'd somehow overlooked before, small moments and exchanges that suddenly took on new meaning under the harsh light of what I now understood about Rebecca's true feelings. It started with the way she spoke to me when Sophia wasn't around. When my granddaughter was present, Rebecca maintained a veneer of pleasantness, calling me Grandma Esther and making small talk about the weather or Sophia's school activities. But when it was just the adults, her tone shifted to something more clipped and efficient, as if I were a service provider rather than family. Friday evening, Marcus was out at what he called a networking event, but which I suspected was drinks with his unemployed friends at the local sports bar. Rebecca was in the living room with her laptop, working on what appeared to be a presentation for Monday's client meeting. Sophia was upstairs in her room, supposedly doing homework but more likely reading the mystery novels she'd discovered at the school library. I was in the kitchen, preparing a grocery list for Saturday's shopping trip, when Rebecca called out without looking up from her screen. "Esther, we need more of that expensive coffee you buy. The French roast. Also, pick up some of those crackers that cost $12 a box. The ones with the seeds." The casual entitlement in her voice made me pause. Not, "Could you please add coffee to the list," or "Would you mind picking up some crackers when you're out?" Just a direct command, as if I were her personal shopper rather than the woman who owned the house she lived in rent-free. "Of course," I replied mildly, adding the items to my list. "Anything else?" "Organic milk. The kind in the glass bottles. Sophia's pediatrician says regular milk has too many hormones." She still hadn't looked up from her laptop. "And see if they have those gluten-free cookies she likes. The expensive ones from the natural food section." I continued writing, noting the way she specified expensive items as if cost were no object, as if she were personally funding these purchases, rather than depending on my social security and pension to cover household expenses. Over the past 2 years, the grocery bills had increased significantly as Rebecca's preferences had grown more particular and costly. Organic this, artisanal that, specialty items that cost 3 times as much as their conventional alternatives. When I'd first noticed the increase, I'd attributed it to inflation and the addition of 3 more people to feed. I'd adjusted my budget accordingly, cutting back on my own small luxuries to accommodate the family's needs. Now I realized that Rebecca had been systematically upgrading our household purchases to match her preferences, regardless of the financial impact on me. "The grocery bills have been running quite high lately," I said carefully, testing the waters. "Perhaps we could look at some more budget-friendly alternatives for some items." Rebecca's fingers stopped clicking on her keyboard. She looked up at me with an expression of mild annoyance, as if I'd just suggested something unreasonable. "We can't scrimp on Sophia's nutrition," she said. "Growing children need quality food, not generic brands full of chemicals and preservatives." "I thought you of all people would understand that." The implied criticism stung. I of all people, having successfully raised 3 healthy children on a much tighter budget than we currently enjoyed. I of all people, who'd managed to provide nutritious meals throughout economic downturns and Harold's periodic layoffs from the steel plant. Apparently my decades of careful household management meant nothing compared to Rebecca's recently acquired expertise in pediatric nutrition. Of course Sophia's health is important, I replied evenly. I just thought we might find some middle ground between generic brands and the most expensive options. Rebecca sighed in the way people do when they're being forced to explain something obvious to someone slow. Esther, I appreciate your concern about the budget, but Marcus and I are planning to contribute more to household expenses once he finds a new position. In the meantime, we can't compromise on essentials. Planning to contribute. Once he finds a position. These were the same vague promises I'd been hearing for 2 years, ever since they'd moved in for their temporary stay. Marcus had been between jobs for most of that time, following up on leads that never materialized, interviewing for positions that always went to someone else, pursuing opportunities that somehow never worked out. Meanwhile, Rebecca's income from the marketing firm covered their personal expenses and car payments, but contributed nothing to the household budget I'd been managing alone. The utilities, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and groceries all came from my fixed income, a fact that was somehow never acknowledged in discussions about family finances. That would be helpful, I said neutrally, making a note to review my bank statements more carefully. I'd been so focused on making sure there was enough money to cover everything that I hadn't been tracking exactly how much extra I was spending to accommodate their preferences. Saturday morning's grocery trip was enlightening in ways I hadn't expected. Armed with Rebecca's extensive list of expensive items, I paid closer attention to the total at checkout than I had in months. $237 for 1 week's groceries for a family of 4. Before Marcus and his family moved in, my weekly grocery bill had averaged $80, including everything from cleaning supplies to my morning coffee. I drove home thinking about the numbers. An extra $150 per week meant an additional $600 per month in grocery expenses alone. Over the 2 years they'd been living with me, that amounted to more than $14,000 in increased food costs. Money that had come entirely from my retirement income while Rebecca and Marcus made vague promises about future contributions that never materialized. The financial revelation was troubling, but what bothered me more was the pattern it revealed. Rebecca wasn't just taking advantage of my hospitality, she was actively reshaping my household to match her preferences while leaving me to absorb all the costs. She was treating my home like her personal domain and me like the staff member responsible for maintaining it according to her standards. When I returned from shopping, I found Rebecca in the kitchen making coffee with her usual Saturday morning efficiency. She was dressed for yoga class and expensive athletic wear that probably cost more than I spent on clothing in 6 months. "Did you find everything on the list?" she asked, beginning to unpack the grocery bags I'd set on the counter. "Everything except the gluten-free cookies," I replied. "They were out of stock." Rebecca frowned. "Did you ask someone to check the back? Sometimes they have more inventory that isn't displayed yet." I asked. "They're expecting a shipment on Tuesday." She shook her head in the exaggerated way people do when minor inconveniences confirm their worst expectations about the world. "This is exactly why we need to start shopping somewhere with better selection. That little market you go to is fine for basic items, but they're not equipped for families with specific dietary needs." The little market I went to was Friedman's, a family-owned grocery store where I'd shopped for 35 years. Sam Friedman had carried me through the lean times when Harold was laid off, extending informal credit when I needed it and always making sure the best produce was set aside for regular customers. His son David had taken over the business 5 years ago and maintained the same level of personal service that made grocery shopping a pleasant social experience rather than a chore. "Friedman's has served our family well for decades," I said mildly. "They special order items when customers request them, and their prices are very reasonable." "Reasonable isn't the same as adequate," Rebecca replied, pulling the expensive French roast coffee from one of the bags. "There's a Whole Foods about 15 minutes further out. Much better selection, higher quality standards. That's where I shop when I'm picking up specific items." When she shops. The phrase hung in the air between us. Rebecca occasionally made solo trips to purchase specialty items for herself, always paying with her own credit card, never offering to pick up anything for the general household while she was there. These excursions were presented as personal errands rather than contributions to family grocery shopping. "Perhaps we could visit together sometime," I suggested. "I'd be interested in seeing what they offer." Rebecca's smile was the kind adults give children who've asked naive questions. "Oh, Esther, you'd probably find it overwhelming. It's much larger than what you're used to, and the prices reflect the quality." I know you're concerned about staying within budget. The condescension was breathtaking. I was apparently too provincial. For Whole Foods, too budget-conscious to appreciate quality, too set in my ways to adapt to modern shopping experiences. Never mind that I'd been managing household budgets since before Rebecca was born, successfully stretching dollars through economic recessions and family crises. My decades of experience were irrelevant compared to her sophisticated understanding of contemporary consumer standards. That afternoon, while Rebecca was at yoga class and Marcus was doing whatever he did on Saturday afternoons that kept him away from the house for hours, I sat down with my financial records. I'd always been meticulous about tracking expenses, a habit formed during the years when Harold's income fluctuated with the steel industry's boom and bust cycles. The numbers were even more stark when laid out systematically. Groceries had increased by an average of $600 per month. Utilities had gone up by about $150 monthly, reflecting the additional usage from 3 more people living in the house. Insurance costs had increased when I added Marcus and his family to my homeowner's policy. Even small expenses like household supplies and personal items had crept upward as Rebecca's preferences influenced purchasing decisions. In total, having Marcus and his family live with me was costing approximately $850 more per month than my previous expenses. Over 2 years, that amounted to more than $20,000 in additional costs, all absorbed by my retirement income while receiving no financial contribution from either Marcus or Rebecca. $20,000. Enough for a luxury cruise around the world, or a new car, or significant home improvements, or simply peace of mind in my retirement years. Instead, it had gone to subsidize the lifestyle of a family that apparently viewed my sacrifices as inadequate and my hospitality as embarrassing. I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by bank statements and receipts, feeling something shift inside me. Not anger yet, but a cold clarity about the reality of my situation. I wasn't living with grateful family members who were temporarily down on their luck. I was supporting entitled relatives who took my generosity for granted while criticizing my competence behind my back. Sunday dinner that week provided another enlightening glimpse into the family dynamics I'd somehow failed to notice before. I'd prepared one of my signature meals, pot roast with vegetables, using a recipe I'd perfected over decades of Sunday dinners. The meat was tender, the vegetables perfectly cooked, the gravy rich and flavorful. It was comfort food at its finest, the kind of meal that had drawn praise from friends and family for years. Sophia, as always, was enthusiastic about the food, asking for seconds and complimenting the gravy. Marcus ate with his usual quiet appreciation, making positive comments about the tenderness of the meat. But Rebecca approached the meal with what I now recognized as barely concealed criticism. She cut her meat into small pieces, examining each bite before eating it. She pushed the carrots around her plate, eating only a few. She asked for salt before tasting the potatoes, then added pepper as well. Throughout the meal, she made small comments that sounded like observations but felt like critiques. "The meat is very tender," she said, in a tone that somehow managed to make tenderness sound like a flaw. "Almost falling apart. The vegetables are cooked quite thoroughly," she added later, as if thorough cooking were evidence of poor technique rather than careful preparation. When Sophia asked for more gravy, Rebecca intervened. "That's probably enough, sweetheart. Too much sauce isn't healthy." Too much sauce. My homemade gravy, prepared from the pan drippings and seasoned with herbs from my own garden, was apparently unhealthy in Rebecca's expert opinion. Never mind that gravy had been a beloved part of Sunday dinners in this house for 37 years, or that Sophia clearly enjoyed it, or that a small amount of rich sauce was hardly going to compromise anyone's nutritional well-being. After dinner, while I was clearing the table, Rebecca made her intentions clear. "Sophia, why don't you help Grandma Esther with the dishes?" she suggested, though it sounded more like a directive than a request. I'm sure she'd appreciate the assistance. The message was unmistakable. I needed help with tasks I'd been managing independently for decades. The assumption that clearing a dinner table was beyond my capabilities was both insulting and revealing. Rebecca saw me as someone whose competence was declining, whose abilities needed to be supplemented by others, whose independence was more theoretical than real. "I can manage fine," I said pleasantly. "Sophia should finish her homework." "Oh, it's no trouble," Rebecca replied, not bothering to ask Sophia what she preferred. "She needs to learn responsibility anyway. Helping with household chores is good for children." Household chores. My kitchen, my dishes, my cooking, my cleaning, but somehow it was a chore for Sophia to help with rather than an opportunity to spend time with her grandmother. The framing revealed how Rebecca viewed my domestic activities, as work that needed to be distributed rather than expressions of care that brought families together. "Sophia, caught between her mother's directive and her own preferences, looked uncertain. I could see her trying to navigate the conflicting expectations without disappointing anyone. "You know what, Sophia?" I said with a smile. "Why don't you keep me company while I clean up? You can tell me about your homework while I wash dishes." It was a compromise that satisfied everyone on the surface while preserving my autonomy and Sophia's choice in the matter. But I filed away the incident as another example of Rebecca's systematic undermining of my authority in my own home. Monday morning brought a revelation that crystallized everything I'd been observing over the weekend. I was in my study, paying bills and updating my financial records, when I heard Rebecca on the phone in the kitchen. Her voice carried clearly through the house's old heating vents, a quirk of the Victorian architecture that had allowed me to monitor my children's phone conversations when they were teenagers. She was talking to her sister, Jennifer, who lived in California with her husband and 2 young children. The sisters spoke regularly, usually comparing notes about their lives and families with the mixture of affection and competition that seemed to characterize their relationship. "Marcus is still looking for work," Rebecca was saying, "but honestly, I think he's gotten comfortable with the current arrangement. Why rush into a stressful job when his mother is happy to support us? Happy to support them. Not grateful for their company, not providing temporary assistance during a difficult time, but happy to support them. As if my financial contributions were gifts I was pleased to give rather than sacrifices I was making for family. The house is gorgeous," Rebecca continued, "and the location is perfect for Sophia's school. We're basically living in a $300,000 home for free. Even if Marcus finds work, it would be crazy to give up this arrangement anytime soon." $300,000. Rebecca had apparently researched the current market value of my home, the home Harold and I had bought for $68,000 in 1987 and transformed through decades of improvements and careful maintenance. She knew exactly what she was getting for free, and she was planning to continue getting it indefinitely. "What about his mother?" Jennifer asked, her voice faint but audible through the heating vent. "Doesn't she mind having a full house?" Rebecca laughed, a sound that made my stomach clench. "Oh, Esther loves having us here. She's one of those women who needs to feel needed, you know? Taking care of everyone is her whole identity. Without us, she'd just be a lonely old woman rattling around in this big house." Lonely old woman. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. That's how Rebecca saw me, not as a competent adult who'd chosen to help her family, but as a pathetic figure whose life had no meaning beyond serving others. My hospitality wasn't generosity, it was desperation. My care for Sophia wasn't love, it was neediness. My management of the household wasn't competence, it was the desperate activity of someone who had nothing else to live for. Plus, Rebecca added, lowering her voice to a more confidential tone, she's starting to show her age. Little things, like forgetting where she put her glasses or asking the same question twice. Nothing serious yet, but it's probably good that we're here to keep an eye on things. Starting to show my age. The same narrative she'd been building. With Marcus, the same story she'd tell anyone who questioned why a successful marketing professional and her husband were living rent-free with his 71-year-old mother. I wasn't supporting them, they were supervising me. I wasn't providing assistance, I was receiving care. My occasional moments of normal human forgetfulness were evidence of cognitive decline that justified their permanent residence in my home. The only real issue, Rebecca continued, is that she sometimes gets these ideas about being more involved than she should be. Like wanting to host Christmas dinner again this year. Last year was honestly embarrassing, and I can't let her put herself through that again. Or put my parents through it again. There it was, the same story she'd told Marcus, refined for a different audience. She was protecting me from embarrassment, shielding my family from my inadequacies, preventing me from humiliating myself through misguided attempts to maintain traditions I was no longer capable of handling properly. "How are you going to handle that?" Jennifer asked. "Carefully," Rebecca replied. "She's very attached to the idea of being the family matriarch, so we have to make any changes seem like they're for her benefit. Marcus is going to talk to her about how much work Christmas dinner is, how she deserves to relax and let someone else take over. Frame it as a gift to her rather than us taking something away." The manipulation was sophisticated and thorough. Rebecca had analyzed my motivations, anticipated my resistance, and developed a strategy for overcoming my objections while making me grateful for the privilege of being pushed aside. She understood that direct confrontation would fail, so she was planning to convince me that accepting my demotion was actually a form of self-care. "What if she doesn't buy it?" Jennifer asked. Rebecca's laugh was confident, almost smug. "She will. Esther is a people-pleaser at heart. She won't want to cause conflict or make waves. As long as we present it the right way, she'll go along with whatever we suggest. She always does. She always does." The casual dismissal of my agency, the assumption that I could be managed and manipulated without resistance, the confidence that my people-pleasing nature made me predictably controllable. Rebecca had studied me like a psychology experiment, identified my weaknesses, and developed a strategy for exploiting them. I sat in my study, surrounded by financial documents that proved I'd been subsidizing their lifestyle to the tune of $20,000, listening to Rebecca explain to her sister how easy it was to manipulate me into giving up my cherished traditions. The combination of financial exploitation and emotional manipulation was breathtaking in its scope and calculation. For 37 years, I'd hosted Christmas dinner in this house. For 2 years, I'd supported Marcus and his family through their financial difficulties without complaint or resentment. For decades, I'd been the kind of woman who put family needs ahead of personal preferences, who sacrificed quietly for the people she loved, who found joy in caring for others. And this was how Rebecca saw me, as a lonely old woman whose desperation to feel needed made her easy to exploit and control. I closed my financial files and walked upstairs to my bedroom, needing space to think without the risk of being overheard. I sat on the edge of the bed Harold and I had shared for 43 years, looking out the window at the garden we'd planted together, the trees we'd watched grow from saplings to towering oaks that now shaded the entire backyard. Rebecca was right about one thing: I was a people pleaser by nature. I did prefer harmony to conflict, cooperation to confrontation. I'd spent my life smoothing over difficulties, accommodating other people's needs, finding ways to make situations work for everyone involved. It was a trait that had served me well as a wife, mother, and teacher, allowing me to navigate complex relationships and challenging circumstances with grace and diplomacy. But Rebecca had mistaken my preference for peace with an inability to fight when necessary. She'd confused my willingness to accommodate with a lack of backbone. She'd assumed that my generous nature meant I was too weak or naive to recognize when I was being taken advantage of. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The conversation I'd overheard had revealed the full scope of their plans and the depth of their disrespect. They weren't just planning to take over Christmas dinner, they were planning to continue living in my house indefinitely while portraying me as an aging woman who needed their supervision and care. They were going to systematically strip away my authority and autonomy while convincing me it was for my own good. Rebecca thought she understood me, thought she could predict my responses and manage my reactions. But she'd made a crucial error in her psychological assessment. I wasn't just a people pleaser, I was also Harold Cohen's widow and the woman who'd raised 3 successful children mostly on my own. I was someone who'd navigated decades of challenges through strategic thinking and careful planning, who'd learned that the most effective responses to difficult situations weren't always the most obvious ones. If Rebecca wanted to play psychological games, I was ready to play. But I'd be playing by rules she didn't know existed, using strategies she couldn't anticipate, drawing on resources she didn't know I possessed. She thought my age and nature made me vulnerable to manipulation. She was about to discover that my age and experience made me far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. Tuesday evening, Marcus approached me with the carefully rehearsed conversation Rebecca had planned. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when he came in with the sort of awkward energy that indicated he'd been rehearsing what he was going to say. "Mom," he began, leaning against the counter in a casual pose that looked anything but natural. "Rebecca and I have been talking about Christmas plans." I continued chopping vegetables for the stew I was making, keeping my expression neutral and interested. "Oh? What kind of plans?" "Well, we were thinking about how much work Christmas dinner is for you," he said, following what was obviously a script. "You put so much effort into making everything perfect, and we thought maybe this year you should get to relax and enjoy the holiday instead of spending all day in the kitchen." The delivery was wooden, unconvincing, like a bad actor reading lines he didn't believe. Marcus had never been good at deception, a trait I'd appreciated when he was a teenager but which now made Rebecca's manipulation attempts painfully obvious. "I enjoy cooking Christmas dinner," I replied mildly, not looking up from my vegetables. "It's always been one of my favorite traditions." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, clearly not prepared for that response. I know. But you've been doing it for so many years. Don't you think it's time to let someone else take a turn?" Someone else. Not us or Rebecca and me, but the vague someone else that was supposed to make the transition seem natural rather than like a hostile takeover. "Who did you have in mind?" I asked, still keeping my tone conversational and interested. Another uncomfortable shift. "Well, Rebecca really enjoys cooking, and she's been wanting to try hosting a big dinner. She has some ideas for the menu, maybe something a little different from our usual traditional meal." Something different from our traditional meal. The meal that had been refined over 37 years of Christmas dinners, the combination of dishes that reflected our family's history and preferences, the carefully balanced menu that accommodated everyone from Sophia's young palate to my sister's dietary restrictions. Rebecca wanted to replace all of that with her own ideas, her own vision of what Christmas dinner should be. What kind of different? I asked. Marcus looked trapped, clearly not having anticipated follow-up questions. Oh, just more modern. I think. Contemporary flavors. Maybe some vegetarian options. Vegetarian options for a family that had never expressed any interest in vegetarian food. Modern flavors to replace the traditional dishes that had been requested year after year by family members who looked forward to specific items that only appeared at Christmas dinner. Contemporary cooking to replace the recipes that connected us to previous generations and shared family memories. That sounds ambitious, I said neutrally. Has Rebecca planned large dinners before? The question clearly made Marcus uncomfortable, since the answer was obviously no. Rebecca's cooking experience was limited to weeknight meals for 3 people and the occasional dinner party for 4 or 6 guests. She'd never attempted anything approaching the complexity of Christmas dinner for 12 people, with its multiple courses and carefully coordinated timing. She's a very good cook, Marcus said defensively. And she's been researching recipes, watching cooking shows. She's really excited about it. Excited about it. Like Christmas dinner was a hobby project, rather than a family tradition with deep emotional significance for multiple generations. Like the meal was an opportunity for Rebecca to showcase her culinary ambitions rather than a celebration of family history and togetherness. I set down my knife and turned to face my son directly. Marcus, is this what you want, or is this what Rebecca wants? The question caught him off guard, and for a moment I saw the little boy I'd raised, the one who'd always been honest with me even when honesty got him in trouble. I want you to be happy, Mom, he said, and I could hear the sincerity beneath the rehearsed script. If hosting Christmas dinner makes you happy, then that's what matters to me. It was the most honest thing he'd said since the conversation began, and it gave me hope that somewhere beneath Rebecca's influence, my son still existed. It does make me happy, I said gently. It's one of the things I look forward to most every year. The planning, the cooking, the chance to bring the whole family together in the house where you grew up. It connects me to your father, to your childhood, to all the Christmas dinners we've shared over the years. Marcus's face softened, and I could see him wavering between his wife's instructions and his own feelings about family traditions. But if you and Rebecca feel strongly about making changes, I continued, perhaps we could find a way to work together. She could handle some dishes while I handle others. We could blend the traditional with the contemporary. It was a reasonable compromise, the kind of solution that would have satisfied most people who genuinely cared about family harmony. But I already knew Rebecca wouldn't accept it, because this wasn't really about cooking or hosting or even Christmas dinner. This was about power and control, about establishing who made decisions in this household. Marcus brightened, clearly relieved to have found a middle ground. That sounds great, Mom. I'm sure Rebecca would love that idea. But when he presented the compromise to Rebecca that evening, her response confirmed everything I'd suspected about her true motivations. That won't work, she said flatly, not even bothering to pretend she was considering it. Having 2 people trying to coordinate a meal that complex would be a disaster. Someone needs to be in charge, and since I'm doing most of the work, it should be me. Most of the work. In my kitchen, using my dishes, serving my family, in my house. But somehow Rebecca would be doing most of the work because she'd appointed herself the person in charge. Mom offered to handle some of the traditional dishes, Marcus said weakly. Maybe she could do the things she's always done, and you could add some new items. Marcus, we've been through this, Rebecca replied with exaggerated patience. Your mother is 71 years old. Cooking for 12 people is exhausting work, and it's not fair to put that pressure on her. I'm trying to give her a break, to let her enjoy Christmas instead of worrying about timing and temperatures and whether everything will turn out right. The manipulation was masterful. Rebecca had transformed her desire to control Christmas dinner into a compassionate concern for my well-being. She'd made my offer to share the work sound like dangerous overexertion rather than reasonable cooperation. She'd positioned herself as my protector rather than my replacement. I appreciate the concern, I interjected, but I'm perfectly capable of handling my share of the cooking. I've been doing it successfully for decades. Rebecca's smile was the kind reserved for people who don't understand their own limitations. Of course you have, Esther. But things are different now. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Let someone else take care of Christmas dinner this year. You've earned the right to relax. Earned the right to relax. Like competence was something that expired with age, like experience became irrelevant after a certain birthday, like my decades of successful holiday entertaining meant nothing compared to Rebecca's 20-something expertise in contemporary cuisine. What if I don't want to relax? I asked. What if I want to continue hosting Christmas dinner in my own home? The question hung in the air between us, and for the first time, Rebecca's diplomatic mask slipped slightly. I could see irritation flash across her features before she composed herself again. Then we'll have to be honest about what's best for everyone, she said, her voice taking on a harder edge. Last year's dinner was stressful for you and uncomfortable. For the guests. I can't let that happen again, especially with my parents coming. Sometimes caring about someone means making difficult decisions for their own good. There it was. The ultimatum delivered with the pretense of kindness. Submit to her authority or be declared incompetent. Accept her judgment about my capabilities or be portrayed as a stubborn old woman who put her pride ahead of family harmony. Marcus looked between his wife and his mother like a man watching a tennis match, clearly hoping someone else would resolve the conflict so he wouldn't have to choose sides. I understand your concerns, I said calmly, though my heart was racing with anger and hurt. Let me think about what you've said. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't resistance either. It was the kind of diplomatic non-response I'd perfected over decades of navigating difficult conversations. Rebecca seemed satisfied, probably interpreting my measured tone as capitulation. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, processing the full scope of what had just happened. Rebecca had issued an ultimatum disguised as concern. Marcus had failed to defend me or stand up for my right to make decisions about my own home and traditions. Together, they'd made it clear that my role in this family was whatever they decided it should be, subject to their approval and supervision. I thought about the $20,000 I'd spent supporting their lifestyle. I thought about the grocery bills that continued to climb as Rebecca's tastes grew more expensive. I thought about the way she spoke to me when Sophia wasn't around. The casual entitlement in her voice when she issued orders about shopping and household management. Most of all, I thought about the conversation I'd overheard, the one where Rebecca had explained to her sister how easy it was to manipulate me because I was a lonely old woman who needed to feel needed. Rebecca had studied me carefully, identified what she thought were my weaknesses, and developed a strategy for controlling me that relied on my desire to avoid conflict and maintain family harmony. She'd calculated that I would eventually submit to her demands rather than risk damaging relationships with my son and granddaughter. She'd made one crucial miscalculation. I wasn't just someone who avoided conflict, I was someone who understood the difference between battles worth fighting and battles worth avoiding. Christmas dinner in my own home, using my own resources, maintaining traditions that connected me to my late husband and my family's history, was absolutely a battle worth fighting. But I wasn't going to fight it the way Rebecca expected. I wasn't going to argue or plead or try to convince anyone of my competence. I wasn't going to make emotional appeals about fairness or respect or family loyalty. I was going to remind Rebecca and Marcus that there were consequences for taking advantage of people who'd been generous to them. I was going to show them that underestimating someone because of their age and nature was a dangerous mistake. I was going to demonstrate that the woman they thought they could manipulate and control had resources and options they'd never considered. Rebecca wanted to play games with my dignity and autonomy. She thought she could systematically strip away my authority while making me grateful for the process. She was about to learn that when you play games with someone who has nothing left to lose, you'd better be very sure you understand what you're risking. Wednesday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of November weather that makes Christmas feel both distant and inevitable. I woke earlier than usual, my mind already sharp with purpose. The conversation with Marcus and Rebecca the night before had crystallized something that had been building for weeks. I was done being managed, manipulated, and marginalized in my own home. But before I could address the Christmas dinner situation effectively, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. Knowledge, as Harold used to say, was the foundation of all good strategy. If Rebecca and Marcus thought they could exploit my generosity indefinitely while undermining my authority, I needed to know the full extent of their presumptions and plans. I made my coffee and settled in my study with my laptop, something I'd learned to use competently despite Rebecca's assumptions about my technological limitations. At 71, I might not be a digital native, but I wasn't the helpless amateur she apparently believed me to be. My first stop was a property value website to confirm what Rebecca had told her sister about the current worth of my home. The estimate that appeared on my screen was actually higher than what Rebecca had mentioned. $345,000, reflecting not just the market appreciation over the past 37 years, but the improvements Harold and I had made over the decades. The new roof we'd installed in 2018, the kitchen renovation from 2015, the refinished hardwood floors, the updated electrical system, the landscaping that had matured into something genuinely beautiful. Every improvement had been planned carefully, saved for diligently, and executed with an eye toward long-term value. Harold and I had treated this house as more than just shelter. It was our family's foundation, our legacy, our most significant asset. Seeing the current value spelled out in stark numbers made Rebecca's casual attitude toward living here rent-free even more galling. Next, I researched rental prices for similar homes in our neighborhood. 3-bedroom houses comparable to mine were renting for between $2,500 and $3,000 per month. Even at the low end, Marcus and Rebecca were receiving the equivalent of $30,000 annually in free housing, on top of my subsidizing their food, utilities, and household expenses. I opened a spreadsheet and began calculating the true cost of their residency. $20,000 in grocery and utility overages over 2 years. $30,000 annually in equivalent rent value. Insurance increases. Wear and tear on the house from additional occupants. Property tax increases due to the higher assessment that came with recent improvements. The total was staggering. Over the 2 years they'd been living with me, I'd provided them with benefits worth approximately $75,000. $75,000 that had come entirely from my retirement income, while receiving not just zero financial contribution from them, but active criticism of my management and competence. I leaned back in my desk chair, staring at the numbers on my screen. $75,000. More than some people earned in an entire year. More than I'd ever spent on myself for anything except this house. More than Harold and I had saved for our first home down payment back in 1987. And for this enormous financial gift, I was being rewarded with Rebecca's systematic campaign to undermine my authority and Marcus's weak refusal to defend me. They were living in my house for free while planning to strip away my cherished traditions and portray me as an aging woman who needed their supervision. I printed out the financial summary and property information, then locked the documents in the small safe Harold had installed in our bedroom closet. I wasn't ready to confront Marcus and Rebecca with these numbers yet, but I wanted to have concrete evidence of their exploitation when the time came. The next phase of my research required a trip to the public library, where I could access resources without leaving a digital trail on my home computer. I told Rebecca I was going to volunteer at the food bank, which was partially true since I planned to stop there after the library, and drove downtown. The librarian at the reference desk was a woman named Patricia whom I'd known casually for years through various community activities. She was in her 50s, competent and discreet, exactly the kind of person who could help me find information without asking uncomfortable questions. I need to research some legal questions about property rights and tenant relationships, I told her. Nothing urgent, just want to understand my options in a hypothetical situation. Patricia led me to a computer terminal and showed me how to access legal databases and tenant rights websites. What I learned over the next 2 hours was both reassuring and concerning. On the positive side, since Marcus and Rebecca had never signed a lease or established formal tenancy, they had far fewer legal protections than traditional renters. They were essentially houseguests who'd overstayed their welcome, and I had broad authority to establish rules for their residency or ask them to leave with reasonable notice. On the concerning side, because they'd been living in the house for more than 2 years and could demonstrate established residency, removing them if they chose to resist could be complicated and time-consuming. They couldn't claim tenant rights in court, but they could make the eviction process difficult if they decided to fight it. More importantly for my immediate concerns, I learned that as the sole owner of the property, I had complete authority over how it was used for entertaining and family gatherings. Rebecca's plans to take over Christmas dinner hosting had no legal standing whatsoever. If I chose to host Christmas dinner, that was entirely my right, and neither she nor Marcus could prevent it or override my decisions about menu, guest list, or any other aspect of the celebration. The legal research was empowering, but it also clarified that my most effective strategies would be financial and social rather than legal. I could establish my authority through economic pressure and family dynamics more efficiently than through courts and formal processes. I spent another hour researching credit reporting and financial privacy laws, learning about the various ways people could damage someone's credit rating and financial reputation. I wasn't planning anything illegal or unethical, but I wanted to understand the landscape of financial consequences that could result from different actions. When I finally left the library, I felt armed with information and options I hadn't possessed that morning. Knowledge really was power, and I now had a much clearer understanding of my rights, their vulnerabilities, and the various tools available for addressing the situation. My next stop was the food bank, where I'd been volunteering every Wednesday for the past 3 years. The work was satisfying and the people were genuinely appreciative, but today I had an additional agenda. I needed to talk to someone who understood family dynamics and financial manipulation from a professional perspective. Maria Santos, the food bank's director, was a licensed social worker who'd spent 15 years helping families navigate complex domestic situations. She was about my daughter's age, bilingual, and possessed the kind of practical wisdom that comes from seeing every variety of human behavior in stressful circumstances. We worked together sorting donations for about an hour before I brought up my situation, framing it hypothetically as I'd done with the librarian. Maria, I have a friend who's dealing with a difficult family situation, I began while organizing canned goods by expiration date. Her adult child and his family have been living with her for a couple of years, supposedly temporarily, but they're not contributing financially and they're starting to make decisions about her house and activities as if they have authority over her. Maria paused in her sorting, immediately recognizing the seriousness of what I was describing. How old is your friend? 70s. Widowed. Financially stable but not wealthy. She's been very generous with this family, but they seem to be taking advantage of her generosity while undermining her independence. Unfortunately, that's not an uncommon situation, Maria said carefully. Adult children sometimes develop a sense of entitlement about their parents' resources, especially when the parents have been very giving. Is your friend in any physical danger? No, nothing like that. It's more subtle. They're questioning her competence, making decisions for her, treating her like she needs supervision rather than respecting her autonomy. Maria nodded thoughtfully. Financial elder abuse often starts exactly like that. It begins with small undermining behaviors that make the older person question their own judgment, then gradually escalates to more direct control over finances and decision-making. Financial elder abuse. I hadn't thought of my situation in those terms, but Maria's description was unnervingly accurate. Rebecca's systematic criticism of my abilities, her expensive shopping preferences that I was expected to fund, her plans to take over my Christmas hosting, Marcus's failure to contribute financially while making decisions about my household. What would you advise someone in that situation? I asked. Document everything, Maria replied immediately. Financial records, examples of undermining behavior, any attempts to isolate her from friends or activities. Create a paper trail that demonstrates the pattern of exploitation and manipulation. And then what? That depends on what outcome she wants. If she wants the family to leave, she needs to establish clear boundaries and consequences. If she wants them to stay but change their behavior, she needs leverage to force that change. Either way, she needs to stop enabling the behavior by continuing to absorb all the costs while accepting all the criticism. Stop enabling the behavior. The phrase resonated with uncomfortable accuracy. By continuing to pay all the bills while accepting Rebecca's criticism and Marcus's passivity, I was essentially rewarding them for treating me poorly. I was demonstrating that exploitation had no consequences, that disrespect was tolerated, that my generosity could be taken for granted indefinitely. What kind of leverage would be most effective? I asked. Maria smiled grimly. Money. It's always about money, even when people pretend it's about concern or love or family harmony. If your friend controls the resources they depend on, she has all the leverage she needs. The question is whether she's willing to use it. Whether I was willing to use it. That was indeed the question. For 2 years, I'd prioritized family harmony over my own interests, accommodation over confrontation, generosity over self-protection. I'd absorbed tens of thousands of dollars in costs while being told I was too old and incompetent to host Christmas dinner in my own home. Maybe it was time to prioritize my own interests for a change. That evening, I implemented the first phase of what I was starting to think of as my financial boundaries project. I opened a new checking account at a different bank, one where Marcus and Rebecca had no access or knowledge. Into this account, I transferred a significant portion of my savings, leaving only enough in my regular accounts to cover basic household expenses for the next month. I also opened a new credit card account in my name only, with statements sent to a post office box I rented under the same name. If I was going to start making strategic financial moves, I needed resources that were completely separate from the household accounts Marcus and Rebecca were aware of. The next morning, I had a conversation with Sophia that provided another crucial piece of information about the family dynamics I was dealing with. Grandma Esther, she said while we were making pancakes together, Mom says we might not have Christmas dinner here this year. I kept my voice neutral and interested. Oh? What did she say about that? She said maybe we should go to a restaurant instead, or have it at Aunt Jennifer's house. She said cooking for everyone is too much work for you now. Too much work. For me now. Rebecca was already preparing Sophia for the transition, planting the idea that my age and limitations made traditional Christmas dinner impractical. She was building a narrative that would make her takeover seem natural and inevitable rather than the power grab it actually was. What do you think about that idea? I asked. Sophia frowned, concentrating on flipping a pancake. I like Christmas dinner here. I like helping you cook and setting the table with the fancy dishes. Restaurants don't have gravy like yours. My heart squeezed with affection for this sweet child who appreciated traditions that her mother saw as burdens. Would you be disappointed if we didn't have Christmas dinner here? Yes, she said simply. This house feels like Christmas. Other places just feel like dinner. This house feels like Christmas. Out of the mouths of babes came the most eloquent defense of tradition and continuity I could have imagined. Sophia understood something her mother couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge, that location and history and family connections matter, that some experiences can't be replicated in restaurants or recreated in different settings. Well, I said carefully, nothing's been decided yet. We'll see what happens. But privately, I was more determined than ever to ensure that Christmas dinner happened in this house, with the traditional menu, prepared in my kitchen, served on the china herald and I had received as wedding gifts 46 years ago. Rebecca might think she could manipulate me into giving up my cherished traditions, but she'd underestimated how much those traditions meant to me and to the people who truly mattered. That afternoon, while Rebecca was at work and Marcus was wherever he spent his days, I began implementing phase 2 of my plan. I called my insurance company and updated my homeowner's policy, removing Marcus and Rebecca as covered residents. They were now guests in my home rather than family members with presumed rights to live there indefinitely. I also contacted my attorney, Samuel Brennan, whom I'd known since Harold and I bought the house in 1987. Sam was in his 70s himself, semi-retired but still handling legal affairs for a small group of long-term clients. Esther, good to hear from you, Sam said when I reached him at his office. How are you managing? I'm doing well, Sam, but I have some questions about property rights and family situations. Could we schedule a meeting sometime this week? Of course. Is everything all right? Nothing urgent, just want to make sure I understand my options in a hypothetical situation. We arranged to meet Friday morning at his office. I didn't explain the details over the phone, but Sam had handled enough family legal issues over the decades to recognize when someone needed strategic advice about difficult relatives. Thursday evening brought the conversation I'd been both expecting and dreading. Marcus approached me in the kitchen while I was preparing dinner, wearing the same uncomfortable expression he'd had earlier in the week when delivering Rebecca's ultimatum about Christmas dinner. Mom, Rebecca and I have been talking more about the holiday plans, he began, clearly following another prepared script. We really think it would be best if we handle Christmas dinner this year. I continued seasoning the chicken I was preparing, keeping my movements calm and deliberate. Have you made that decision, or are you still asking for my input? The question seemed to catch him off guard. Well, we're hoping you'll agree that it makes sense. What if I don't agree? Marcus shifted uncomfortably, looking toward the living room where Rebecca was working on her laptop. Mom, we're just trying to do what's best for everyone. You've done so much for us over the years. Let us do this for you. Do this for me. The same framing Rebecca had used, the same narrative that transformed her power grab into a generous gift. They were doing me a favor by taking away something I loved, protecting me from the stress of doing something I'd successfully managed for decades. Marcus, I said, turning to face him directly, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Do you think I'm no longer capable of hosting Christmas dinner? The directness of the question clearly made him uncomfortable. He fidgeted with his hands, looking everywhere except at my face. It's not about capability, Mom. It's about fairness. You shouldn't have to do all that work when Rebecca is willing to take care of it. That doesn't answer my question. Do you think I'm too old, too forgetful, too incompetent to manage Christmas dinner? No, he said quickly, too quickly. Of course not. You're still very capable. It's just what? Rebecca thinks, we both think. Maybe it's time for you to enjoy Christmas instead of working so hard to make it perfect for everyone else. Rebecca thinks. The truth finally emerged. This wasn't Marcus's opinion or even a joint decision. This was Rebecca's plan that Marcus was being pressured to support, regardless of his own feelings about family traditions or my capabilities. What if I told you that working hard to make Christmas perfect for everyone else is how I enjoy Christmas? I asked. Marcus looked genuinely pained, caught between his wife's demands and his mother's feelings. I know, Mom. I know you love doing it. But Rebecca has already started planning, and she's really excited about it. Couldn't you just let her have this one? Let her have this one. Like Christmas dinner was a toy that children needed to share, rather than a family tradition with deep emotional significance that connected generations and honored decades of shared memories. Marcus, do you remember the Christmas when you were 8 and you were convinced that Santa wouldn't be able to find our house because we'd painted the shutters blue? A slight smile crossed his face. You stayed up until 2 in the morning. making footprints in the snow and eating the cookies I'd left out. And the Christmas when you were 16 and brought home that girlfriend whose parents were going through a bitter divorce. Jennifer Morrison. You set 2 extra places at the table and never asked any questions about why she didn't want to go home. And last year, when Sophia was so excited about helping make the stuffing that she accidentally used salt instead of sugar. She cried for 20 minutes until you told her it was the best mistake anyone ever made because now we had a new family story to laugh about. I let those memories settle between us, reminders of what Christmas dinner in this house had meant to our family over the years. Not just food and logistics, but connection and tradition and the creation of shared experiences that became family lore. Those memories happened because Christmas dinner was more than just a meal, I said gently. It was love made visible, family history continued, traditions passed down from one generation to the next. Can Rebecca's restaurant-style dinner create those same memories for Sophia? Marcus's face reflected the internal conflict he was obviously feeling. I could see him remembering not just the specific Christmases I'd mentioned, but the dozens of others when this house had been filled with extended family, friends, neighbors who had nowhere else to go, anyone who needed a place to belong on Christmas Day. Rebecca's not trying to hurt anyone, he said weakly. She just wants to help. By taking away something that brings me joy and connects me to your father's memory? It was emotional manipulation, and I wasn't proud of using Harold's memory as leverage. But Rebecca had been manipulating emotions for months, and I was tired of being the only person in this household who played fair. Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be. I'm not making it hard, Marcus. I'm asking you to consider whether what Rebecca wants is worth taking away something that matters deeply to me. He stood there for a long moment, looking like the little boy who'd been caught between conflicting loyalties, wanting to please everyone and not understanding why that was impossible. What if we compromise? He suggested finally. What if you and Rebecca work together, share the responsibilities? I offered that solution earlier this week. Rebecca rejected it because she wants complete control. Maybe I could talk to her again, explain how important this is to you. Marcus, your wife has made it clear that she considers my age and capabilities to be liabilities rather than assets. She's not interested in compromise or collaboration. She wants me to step aside so she can take over, and she wants me to be grateful for the privilege. The blunt summary of Rebecca's position seemed to surprise him, as if he hadn't quite grasped how dismissive and condescending his wife's attitude toward me had become. She doesn't mean it like that, he said. But his voice lacked conviction. How does she mean it? Marcus opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently unable to find a charitable interpretation of Rebecca's behavior that matched the reality of what had been happening. I need to think about this, he said finally. Yes. I agreed. You do. But while you're thinking, consider this: I've supported your family financially for 2 years without complaint. I've opened my home to you, provided free housing worth tens of thousands of dollars, subsidized your living expenses, and asked for nothing in return except basic respect and consideration. If Rebecca can't show me that courtesy regarding Christmas dinner in my own home, perhaps it's time to reconsider the entire arrangement. The implicit threat was clear, and Marcus's face went pale. For the first time since this conflict began, he seemed to understand that there might be real consequences for taking my generosity for granted. Mom, you don't mean that. I mean exactly that. I'm 71 years old, not dead. I'm still capable of making decisions about my home, my traditions, and who I choose to support with my resources. I turned back to my cooking, signaling that the conversation was over. Marcus stood there for another minute, probably hoping I would soften my position or indicate that my ultimatum wasn't serious. When I didn't say anything more, he left the kitchen with slumped shoulders and the defeated expression of someone who'd finally realized that the game he'd been playing had higher stakes than he'd understood. That evening, I heard him on the phone with Rebecca, their voices carrying through the old house's thin walls and heating vents. I couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was urgent and concerned. Rebecca's voice got progressively sharper as the conversation continued, culminating in what sounded like accusations and demands. Later, after Sophia had gone to bed, Rebecca confronted me directly for the first time since this conflict began. Esther, Marcus says you're upset about Christmas dinner. I was reading in the living room, comfortable in my favorite chair with a cup of tea and a mystery novel. Rebecca stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, her posture defensive and aggressive. I'm not upset, I replied calmly, not looking up from my book. I simply stated my position clearly. Which is what, exactly? That I intend to host Christmas dinner in my home, as I have for 37 years. Even though we've explained why that's not a good idea? You've explained your opinion. I don't share it. Rebecca moved into the room, choosing to stand rather than sit, maintaining the physical advantage of height that was supposed to make her position seem more authoritative. Esther, I know change is difficult at your age, but sometimes we have to accept that we can't do everything we used to do. At my age. The casual ageism was breathtaking, the assumption that turning 71 had somehow rendered me incompetent. Despite evidence to the contrary. I'm not aware of any decline in my abilities, I said, still keeping my voice level and my eyes on my book. Last year's dinner was very stressful for you. We could all see it. Cooking for 9 people is always somewhat stressful. I managed it successfully, as I have many times before. The timing was off, the food was overcooked, you seemed overwhelmed. I closed my book and looked at Rebecca directly for the first time since she'd entered the room. The rolls were slightly overdone and easily salvageable. The timing challenges were normal for a complex meal prepared in a home kitchen. I was not overwhelmed, I was focused on ensuring everyone had a good time. That's not how it seemed to my parents. Your parents' expectations may have been unrealistic for a home-cooked meal prepared by a single person in a residential kitchen. Rebecca's jaw tightened. So now you're criticizing my family? I'm pointing out that different settings create different experiences. If your parents prefer restaurant quality service and presentation, perhaps a restaurant would better meet their needs. We're not changing the location to accommodate my parents. We're changing the arrangements to accommodate your limitations. My limitations. There was the truth, finally spoken plainly. This wasn't about my stress levels or my enjoyment or my well-being. This was about Rebecca's assessment that I was no longer capable of meeting her standards for family entertaining. I'm not aware of any limitations that would prevent me from hosting Christmas dinner, I said. Esther, you're 71 years old. You live alone, you're starting to show signs of forgetfulness, and you're clearly struggling with tasks that used to be easier for you. Starting to show signs of forgetfulness. Struggling with tasks. Rebecca was building a medical case for my incompetence based on the normal minor memory lapses that every human being experiences regardless of age. Can you give me specific examples of these signs and struggles? The question seemed to catch her off guard. Well, you sometimes ask the same question twice, or forget where you put your glasses. Do you have perfect recall of every conversation and never misplace objects? That's different. I'm not 71. It's not different at all. Occasional. Forgetfulness is normal human behavior at any age. It's not evidence of cognitive decline or incompetence. Rebecca's frustration was becoming visible. This conversation wasn't going according to her script, and she was struggling to maintain her position without resorting to more direct attacks on my character or abilities. The point is, she said, trying to regain control of the narrative, hosting Christmas dinner is a lot of work, and there's no reason for you to take on that burden when I'm willing to handle it. Because I want to. Because it's my house. Because it's my tradition. Because it connects me to my late husband. And my family's history. Because it brings me joy. I paused, letting each reason register. Do any of those considerations matter to you? Of course they matter, Rebecca said, but her tone suggested otherwise. But we have to be practical. Your wants aren't the only consideration here. My wants. Like hosting Christmas dinner in my own home was a frivolous preference rather than a meaningful tradition with deep emotional significance. What other considerations take precedence over my wants regarding my own home and traditions? The comfort of the guests. The quality of the meal. The stress on the family. The practical logistics of preparing a complex dinner. Every item on her list was essentially a criticism of my abilities disguised as a general concern. The guests would be more comfortable if someone else cooked. The meal would be better if someone else prepared it. The family would be less stressed if someone else took responsibility. The logistics would be more manageable if someone else handled them. I see, I said. So your position is that I'm too incompetent to host Christmas dinner acceptably. I never said incompetent. Then what word would you use to describe someone who can't provide guest comfort, meal quality, family harmony, or logistical management? Rebecca's face flushed. She'd been caught in her own logic trap, forced to either admit that she was calling me incompetent or find some other explanation for why all these responsibilities needed to be taken away from me. I'm trying to help you, she said finally. By taking away something I love and telling me it's for my own good? By preventing you from struggling with something that's become too difficult for you. There it was again. Too difficult for me. The core assumption underlying all of Rebecca's arguments, that I was no longer capable of managing tasks I'd handled successfully for decades. Rebecca, I said, standing up to match her height advantage, I need you to understand something. Very clearly. I am hosting Christmas dinner in this house this year. That decision is final and non-negotiable. You are welcome to attend as a guest, contribute as a helper, or make other plans for yourself. But you are not taking over my kitchen, my traditions, or my role as hostess in my own home. The directness of my statement clearly shocked her. For months, she'd been gradually escalating her control over household decisions while I accommodated and compromised. She'd apparently assumed that pattern would continue indefinitely. And if I refused to accept that, she asked, her voice taking on a harder edge, then you'll discover that there are consequences for taking advantage of someone's generosity while insulting their competence. What's that supposed to mean? It means that people who live in my house rent-free while criticizing my abilities might want to reconsider their approach to family relationships. The threat was implicit but clear. Rebecca's comfortable arrangement depended entirely on my continued willingness to subsidize her family's lifestyle. If she wanted to escalate this conflict, she'd find out exactly how much leverage I possessed and how willing I was to use it. For the first time since I'd known her, Rebecca looked genuinely uncertain. She'd built her strategy around the assumption that I would avoid conflict at any cost, that my desire for family harmony would override my own interests indefinitely. She was discovering that even the most accommodating people have breaking points, and that pushing someone beyond their limits can be a very expensive mistake. Friday morning's meeting with Samuel Brennan proved to be the turning point I needed. His law office occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian building downtown, with tall windows that overlooked the courthouse square and walls lined with legal volumes that spoke of decades of experience in family law and estate planning. Sam greeted me with the warmth of an old friend, though his expression grew serious as I explained the situation I was facing with Marcus and Rebecca. I laid out the financial details first, the $75,000 in subsidies I'd provided over 2 years, the complete lack of contribution from either of them, the systematic increase in household expenses that reflected Rebecca's expensive preferences. Esther, what you're describing is a textbook case of financial exploitation, Sam said, reviewing the documentation I'd brought. Adult children who move in temporarily and then establish permanent residency while contributing nothing financially, especially when combined with attempts to undermine the parents' decision-making authority. Is there legal recourse available? Several options, depending on what outcome you want to achieve. Sam pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. First, since they have no formal lease agreement and have never established legal tenancy, you have broad authority to set conditions for their continued residence or ask them to leave with reasonable notice. What constitutes reasonable notice? 30 days is standard for family situations, though 60 days shows more consideration for their circumstances. The key is documenting that you've provided proper notice and that any conditions you set are reasonable and clearly communicated. Sam paused, studying my face with the perceptive eye of someone who'd handled thousands of family disputes over the decades. But I suspect you're not looking to evict them immediately. You want them to change their behavior and show proper respect while continuing to live in your home. Exactly. I love my son and granddaughter. I want them in my life. But I won't be taken advantage of while being told I'm incompetent. Then you need leverage that demonstrates the consequences of their current behavior without immediately destroying family relationships. Financial pressure is usually most effective. Sam explained several strategies for establishing financial boundaries that would force Marcus and Rebecca to acknowledge their dependence on my generosity while requiring them to contribute meaningfully to the household they'd been living in for free. The most powerful tool you have is the house itself, he said. They're living in a property worth over $300,000 without paying rent, utilities, or maintenance costs. If you formalize that arrangement and start charging fair market rent, they'll quickly realize how much your generosity has been worth. What if they can't afford market rent? Then they'll need to either find ways to contribute differently, or consider whether this living arrangement still serves their interests. People who complain about free housing usually discover they miss it when it's no longer free. Sam also explained how I could use their credit dependency against them if the situation escalated further. Marcus and Rebecca had been living with me so long that their credit profiles showed minimal housing costs and low debt-to-income ratios. If that suddenly changed, if they were forced to take on significant new financial obligations, their credit ratings would reflect that adjustment in ways that could affect their ability to qualify for mortgages, car loans, or other major purchases. It's not about destroying their credit maliciously, Sam emphasized. It's about ending the artificial subsidies that have been making their financial situation appear more stable than it actually is. When someone's creditworthiness depends on undisclosed support from family members, removing that support reveals their true financial position. The conversation was enlightening and empowering. I wasn't helpless in this situation, and I wasn't limited to pleading for respect or threatening dramatic confrontations. I had substantial leverage that I'd simply never considered using because I'd prioritized family harmony over my own interests. One more thing, Esther, Sam said as our meeting concluded. Document everything from this point forward. Conversations, financial transactions, any attempts to pressure or manipulate you. If this situation escalates, you'll want a clear record of their behavior and your reasonable responses to it. I left Sam's office feeling more confident than I had in weeks. Knowledge really was power, and I now understood exactly what tools were available to address Rebecca's disrespect and Marcus's enablement of her behavior. My first stop after the legal consultation was the bank, where I met with Patricia Wells, the branch manager who'd handled my accounts for over a decade. Patricia was a professional woman in her 40s with a reputation for discretion and competence, exactly the kind of person who could help me implement financial strategies without unnecessary drama. I need to restructure some of my financial arrangements, I told her. I'm going to start charging rent to family members who've been living in my home, and I want to establish separate accounts for managing those transactions. Patricia nodded approvingly. Smart financial planning. Too many people let family members take advantage of them without establishing proper business arrangements. We set up a new checking account specifically for rental income, with automatic transfers to my primary savings account. Patricia also helped me arrange for professional property management services that could handle rent collection, maintenance requests, and other landlord responsibilities if I chose to formalize the arrangement completely. What's fair market rent for a 3-bedroom house in your neighborhood? Patricia asked. I've researched comparable properties. $2,500 to $3,000 per month, depending on specific amenities and conditions. I'd recommend starting at $2,500, Patricia suggested. It demonstrates that you're being reasonable while still establishing the true value of what you've been providing for free. $2,500 per month. $30,000 per year. More than Marcus had earned from his sporadic employment over the past 2 years, and significantly more than Rebecca's discretionary income after her own personal expenses. The mathematics were stark and undeniable. If Marcus and Rebecca wanted to continue living in my house, they would need to either pay fair market rent or acknowledge that their comfortable lifestyle depended entirely on my generosity. Either option would force them to confront the reality of their financial dependence and hopefully inspire more respectful behavior. My next stop was a property management company that specialized in residential rentals. I wasn't ready to hire professional managers yet, but I wanted to understand what services were available if the situation with Marcus and Rebecca deteriorated further. The company representative, David Chen, was enthusiastic about taking on a property in my neighborhood. Houses like yours rent quickly and retain tenants well, he said. The location is excellent, the condition is exceptional, and the rental market in that area is very strong. David explained how professional property management worked, from tenant screening and lease preparation to rent collection and maintenance coordination. The company would handle all aspects of the landlord-tenant relationship for a fee of 8% of monthly rental income. If you decide to rent to family members, David said, I'd strongly recommend using a formal lease agreement just like you would with any other tenants. It protects everyone's interests and prevents misunderstandings about expectations and responsibilities. I took home several sample lease agreements to review, along with information about tenant rights and landlord obligations. The documentation would provide a framework for formalizing Marcus and Rebecca's residency if they chose to remain in the house under new financial terms. That evening, I reviewed all the materials I'd gathered over the day, legal options from Sam, financial strategies from Patricia, property management resources from David. I felt like a general preparing for battle, except the weapons were contracts and bank statements rather than guns and ammunition. The weekend passed quietly, with both Marcus and Rebecca avoiding the topic of Christmas dinner while clearly discussing it privately. I could hear whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered rooms, see glances exchanged when they thought I wasn't paying attention, sense the tension that filled the house like an invisible fog. Sophia seemed to pick up on the adult stress around her, becoming more clingy with me and asking questions about why everyone seemed worried. I reassured her as best I could without explaining the adult conflicts that were affecting the family atmosphere. Are you and Mommy having an argument? She asked while we were baking cookies on Saturday afternoon. Not an argument exactly, I said carefully. Sometimes adults have different ideas about how things should be done, and it takes time to work out the best solution. Is it about Christmas dinner? I heard Mommy talking on the phone about Christmas plans. Smart child. Sophia had inherited her grandfather's perceptive nature along with her father's gentle eyes. Everyone wants Christmas to be special, I said. We're just discussing different ways to make that happen. I hope we have Christmas dinner here, Sophia said, concentrating on cutting cookie shapes with serious precision. I like our traditions. They make me feel connected to Grandpa Harold even though I never met him. Connected to Grandpa Harold. This 8-year-old child understood something her mother couldn't grasp, that traditions carry emotional weight. Beyond their practical functions, that family rituals connect us to our history and to people we've loved who are no longer with us physically. What do you know about Grandpa Harold's Christmas traditions? I asked. Daddy told me he always carved the turkey with the special knife, and he made jokes during dinner that made everyone laugh even when they weren't very funny. And he played Christmas music on the piano after everyone was done eating. Marcus had shared those memories with his daughter, which meant he understood the emotional significance of our Christmas traditions even if he wasn't willing to defend them against Rebecca's criticisms. Harold's presence was still felt in this house during the holidays, still part of what made our celebrations meaningful rather than merely functional. Would you like to learn some of the songs Grandpa Harold used to play? I asked. Sophia's face lit up with excitement. Could I? Do you remember them? I remember every one. We could practice together, and maybe you could play them this Christmas. The idea of Sophia carrying on Harold's musical tradition brought tears to my eyes. Here was a way to honor his memory while creating new connections between generations. Exactly the kind of family continuity that restaurant dinners and contemporary menus couldn't provide. Sunday evening brought the confrontation I'd been expecting since Friday's conversation with Rebecca. She approached me in the kitchen while I was preparing dinner, her expression determined and her posture aggressive. Esther, Marcus and I have been discussing this Christmas situation, and we've decided that we're going to handle the dinner preparations regardless of your objections. I continued chopping vegetables for the stew I was making, keeping my movements calm and deliberate. That's an interesting decision, considering you'll be doing it in my kitchen with my dishes using ingredients I purchase. We'll buy our own ingredients and use our own serving pieces if necessary. In my kitchen. Using my stove and refrigerator. And counter space. Rebecca's jaw tightened. This is ridiculous, Esther. We're trying to help you, and you're acting like we're attacking you. You are attacking me. You're systematically undermining my authority in my own home while expecting me to be grateful for the privilege. We're not undermining anything. We're taking responsibility for tasks that have become too difficult for you. I set down my knife and turned to face Rebecca directly. Let me be absolutely clear about something. You are guests in this house. You pay no rent, no utilities, no maintenance costs, no property taxes. You contribute nothing to the household expenses while driving up costs significantly with your expensive preferences. You have been living here for free for 2 years while I've subsidized your lifestyle to the tune of approximately $75,000. The specific number seemed to shock Rebecca. She'd apparently never calculated the true cost of their residency or considered how much money I'd been spending to support their family. We didn't ask you to spend that much on groceries and things. You didn't ask, but you demanded. Organic milk, artisanal crackers, specialty ingredients, premium brands. Every week the grocery bills climbed higher as your preferences grew more expensive. But you never offered to pay the difference. Rebecca's face flushed. We've been planning to contribute more once Marcus finds steady employment. Planning to contribute. For 2 years, you've been planning. Meanwhile, I've been paying. That was your choice. We never forced you to buy expensive groceries. You're right. It was my choice. Just as it's my choice to stop making that sacrifice for people who show me no appreciation or respect. The threat was becoming more explicit, and Rebecca clearly recognized that the comfortable arrangement she'd taken for granted was in jeopardy. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying that people who live in my house need to follow my rules and show appropriate gratitude for my generosity. If you can't do that, you're welcome to find housing elsewhere. You can't kick us out over a disagreement about Christmas dinner. I can establish whatever conditions I choose for people living in my home rent-free. If those conditions don't suit you, you're free to make other arrangements. Rebecca stared at me for a long moment, apparently trying to determine whether I was bluffing or serious about enforcing consequences for her behavior. This is insane, she said finally. You're threatening to destroy your relationship with your son and granddaughter because you want to control Christmas dinner. I'm not destroying anything. I'm establishing boundaries that should have been set 2 years ago. You can either respect those boundaries or face the consequences of refusing to do so. Marcus will never go along with this. Marcus will have to choose between supporting his wife's disrespectful behavior and maintaining a positive relationship with his mother. I hope he makes the right choice. Rebecca left the kitchen with angry steps and slammed the door to her bedroom hard enough to rattle the windows. Within minutes, I could hear her on the phone, presumably calling her sister or her parents to complain about my unreasonable demands and controlling behavior. Let her complain. Anyone who heard the full story, including the financial details, and the systematic disrespect I'd been enduring, would understand that my position was not only reasonable but long overdue. Monday morning, I implemented the next phase of my plan. I called Marcus at the coffee shop where he spent most of his mornings, allegedly networking and job searching, and asked him to meet me for lunch at a restaurant downtown. We chose a quiet place where we could talk privately, away from Rebecca's influence and Sophia's innocent ears. Marcus looked nervous and tired, clearly stressed by the conflict between his wife and his mother. "Mom, Rebecca is really upset about yesterday's conversation," he began before we'd even ordered our meals. "I'm sure she is. Being held accountable for disrespectful behavior can be uncomfortable. She says you threatened to kick us out if she hosts Christmas dinner." "That's not accurate. I told her that people living in my house need to follow my rules and show appropriate respect. Christmas dinner is just one example of the broader pattern of behavior I'm no longer willing to tolerate." Marcus looked confused, as if he genuinely didn't understand what pattern I was referring to. "What other behavior issues are you talking about?" I pulled out the financial summary I'd prepared, the detailed breakdown of costs and contributions over the past 2 years. Marcus's face grew paler as he reviewed the numbers, apparently seeing for the first time the true magnitude of my financial support for his family. $75,000, I said quietly. "That's what I've spent subsidizing your lifestyle while receiving criticism rather than gratitude, orders rather than requests, disrespect rather than appreciation." "Mom, I had no idea the costs were that high." "Because you never asked. You moved into my house temporarily and then settled in permanently without ever discussing financial arrangements or contributions. I've been looking for work. You know how difficult the job market has been. You've been looking selectively for work that meets your preferences rather than taking available employment that might not match your career goals. Meanwhile, Rebecca has been spending my money on expensive groceries and household items while planning to strip away my role as Christmas hostess because she's embarrassed by my performance." The blunt summary of their behavior clearly shook Marcus. He'd apparently been so focused on avoiding conflict with Rebecca that he'd never considered how the situation looked from my perspective. "What do you want us to do?" he asked. "I want you to start treating me like the homeowner and family matriarch rather than like an aging woman who needs supervision. I want Rebecca to show basic respect for my authority in my own home. And I want you both to either contribute meaningfully to household expenses or acknowledge that your comfortable lifestyle depends entirely on my generosity." "How much contribution are you talking about?" "Fair market rent for the space you're occupying. $2,500 per month." Marcus nearly choked on his coffee. $2,500? We can't afford that kind of money. Then perhaps you should reconsider whether this living arrangement still serves your interests. Mom, please, don't do this over Christmas dinner. It's not worth destroying our family relationship. I'm not destroying anything, Marcus. I'm establishing the same standards that any other homeowner would expect from people living in their house. If that destroys our relationship, it says more about your priorities than mine. Marcus sat quietly for several minutes, apparently processing the reality that his comfortable arrangement with unlimited financial support and minimal responsibilities was coming to an end. "What if we compromise on Christmas dinner?" he suggested finally. "What if Rebecca hosts but you help with some of the traditional dishes?" I already offered that compromise. Rebecca rejected it because she wants complete control. "Maybe I could talk to her again, explain how important this is to you. Marcus, your wife has made it clear that she considers my age and abilities to be liabilities rather than assets. She's not interested in compromise or collaboration. She wants me to step aside gracefully while she takes over, and she wants me to be grateful for the opportunity to be marginalized in my own home." "She's not trying to marginalize you. Then what would you call taking away my cherished traditions while living in my house for free and criticizing my competence?" Marcus had no answer for that, because any honest assessment of Rebecca's behavior would confirm that marginalization was exactly what she was attempting. "I need time to think about this," he said finally. "You have until the end of the week to decide how you want to proceed. Either Rebecca shows me appropriate respect and you both start contributing financially to the household, or you find alternative living arrangements. And if we can't afford the rent you're asking, then you'll discover what housing actually costs when someone isn't subsidizing your lifestyle out of family loyalty." I left Marcus at the restaurant with the financial documents and a week to make his decision. He looked shell-shocked, apparently never having considered that his living situation might have real financial value or that his mother might eventually expect appreciation and respect in exchange for her generosity. Tuesday morning brought an interesting development. Rebecca approached me in the kitchen with an expression that was almost conciliatory, a significant change from her previous aggressive stance. Esther, I think there may have been some misunderstandings about the Christmas dinner situation, she said carefully. What kind of misunderstandings? I never meant to suggest that you couldn't handle cooking. I was just trying to offer help. So you wouldn't feel pressured to do everything yourself. The revisionist narrative was smooth and practiced, transforming her systematic campaign to take over Christmas dinner into a generous offer of assistance that I'd somehow misinterpreted. I see. So when you told Marcus that last year's dinner was a disaster and you couldn't deal with that embarrassment again, you were offering to help? Rebecca's composure slipped slightly. She'd apparently forgotten about that overheard conversation or assumed I wouldn't bring it up directly. I may have expressed some concerns about the complexity of the meal, but I never intended to hurt your feelings. And when you told your sister that I was a lonely old woman whose need to feel needed made me easy to manipulate, you were expressing concern for my well-being? The color drained from Rebecca's face. She'd definitely forgotten about that conversation, conducted when she thought I was safely out of earshot. I don't recall saying anything like that. Your exact words were that I was one of those women who needs to feel needed, and that without you and Marcus, I'd just be a lonely old woman rattling around in this big house. Rebecca stood frozen in the kitchen, apparently trying to calculate how much of her private conversations I'd overheard and how much damage control would be required. I think you may have misunderstood the context of that conversation. I understood the context perfectly. You were explaining to your sister how easy it was to manipulate me because of my emotional vulnerabilities, and how you planned to frame taking over Christmas dinner as a favor to me rather than a power grab for yourself. The accuracy of my summary made denial impossible. Rebecca had been caught in her own words, revealed as someone who'd been systematically manipulating family dynamics while presenting herself as a caring daughter-in-law. What do you want from me? She asked. Finally, abandoning any pretense of innocence. I want you to acknowledge that you've been disrespectful and exploitative. I want you to apologize for attempting to manipulate me while living in my house for free. And I want you to commit to showing appropriate gratitude and respect for my generosity going forward. And if I do that, we can stay? If you do that, and start paying fair market rent for the space you're occupying. Rebecca's face hardened again. We can't afford $2,500 a month in rent. Then you can't afford to live in a $2,500 house. Most people understand that basic principle of economics. You're being vindictive. I'm being realistic. You've been living far above your means because someone else was absorbing the costs. That arrangement is ending. Marcus will never agree to this. Marcus will have to decide whether he wants to maintain a relationship with his mother or enable his wife's disrespectful behavior. I hope he chooses wisely. Rebecca left the kitchen without another word, presumably to call Marcus and demand that he fix the situation she'd created through her own arrogance and manipulation. But I'd already given Marcus all the information he needed to understand what was really at stake. He could either start treating me like a person deserving of respect and appreciation, or he could discover how expensive housing became when you couldn't rely on family subsidies. Either way, the days of taking my generosity for granted while undermining my authority were coming to an end. Rebecca had wanted to play psychological games with someone she thought was too old and weak to fight back effectively. She was about to learn that underestimating people can be a very costly mistake. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.